Have you ever wondered how many of Europe's own promises survive contact with Europe's own calendar? For decades, Europe has told itself a bedtime story about its own paperwork. America barely regulates anything, the story goes, while the old continent writes down every protection its people could ever need, checks it twice, and signs it into law long before a single American company gets the chance to hurt anyone. Ask the man Germany itself just elected chancellor, though, and you get a different bedtime story. He called his own union the world champion of over-regulation and asked for an emergency brake on the very machine he now runs. 10 new protections were supposed to arrive across Europe this year, on 10 separate dates, each one announced like a finish line. A phone finally worth fixing instead of replacing. A paycheck finally allowed to show its own number. A border you could cross without vanishing into a line for 3 hours. A private message Brussels finally decided whether it trusts an algorithm to read. By the time this video went up, 8 of the 10 hadn't actually landed. A phone still not covered in most of the countries that promised it. A payslip still hiding its number in 23 of 27 capitals. A border kiosk still switched off. No launch date left anywhere on the page. Let's count down every new EU law for 2026, weakest excuse first, and watch how fast the plainer American version of the same idea happened without any of it. The real shock isn't any single law on this list. It's the pattern underneath all 10. A directive is not a law anywhere the day it's signed, a detail that never makes it into the press release. It is a homework assignment handed to 27 different governments, each required to write their own version into their own statute book, on their own timetable, checked by their own civil service. Last year alone, the European Commission adopted more than 1,000 of these legislative acts, while completing only 25 impact assessments to check whether any of them actually worked, according to its own industry's own count. Brussels signs first. The second signature never came. Not from all of them. Not on time. Not for most of what follows on this list. Number 10. The parcel fee that arrived on time. The first shock on this list isn't a big one. Picture the doorbell. A courier is holding a package you ordered from outside the EU, and for the first time as a shopper, you owe money before he'll hand it over, standing there, on your own doorstep, in your own country, over a parcel that would have crossed free a year ago. For years, anything under 150 euros crossed the European border, duty-free, no questions, no line item, no surprise. That protection is gone. Since July 1, 2026, every low-value parcel now carries a flat €3 customs charge per line on the declaration. That alone would have been a clean, single change. But Brussels wasn't finished. From November 1, a second fee arrives, €2 for handling, stacked on top of the first, announced separately, 4 months later, like a waiter bringing the check and then coming back an hour later with a second, smaller check he forgot. This is the one item on this list that actually happened exactly when Brussels said it would. It is also the one that shows what on time looks like once Brussels gets involved. Not one fee. 2, staggered 5 months apart, from 2 different offices, over what is, in the end, a single idea. Compare that to the country across the Atlantic. The United States ended its own version of the same exemption, the $800 de minimis threshold, in a single executive action, in a single month, with one new fee structure that applied everywhere at once. One date, one fee, and it was finished. Europe hit its own deadline and still needed twice the paperwork to say the same sentence America said, in one breath. Not late, just clumsy. Somewhere in Brussels, an office that had already announced the first fee apparently needed a second office and a second announcement to remember the handling charge existed. Would you rather pay one fee on one date or 2 fees on 2 dates for the exact same idea? And if this is what Brussels looks like on the one item it actually kept, what happens to the 9 protections it didn't? Number 9. The coffee Europe couldn't clear. In Europe, the story goes that the coffee in your cup the chocolate on your shelf, and the beef on your plate are finally clean. No deforested land anywhere in the supply chain, no shortcuts, proof required at the border before a single bean gets through. That was supposed to be true from December 2024. But that deadline came and went unmet. So Brussels moved it to December 2025. That one came and went too, quietly, without the fanfare the original announcement got. The rule now applies from December 2026 for large importers and June 2027 for the small ones, its second postponement in 2 years. And this time, it arrived bundled with a loosening of exactly what proof a company actually has to produce. A smaller, softer version of the promise it started with. Picture the supermarket shelf while all of this is happening. The chocolate bar hasn't changed. The label hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is the date by which Europe told itself the label would finally mean something. In America, no federal law like it exists at all. No deforestation import rule. No due diligence proof required at any border. Which sounds, on paper, like the argument for Europe. Except a rule that does not exist cannot be late, and a rule that does exist and still is not real is not obviously better. Europe invented a rule to prove its own conscience about the rest of the world's forests. It is not a rule yet, it's a rain check. Twice signed, twice postponed. Which sounds more honest to you? A government that promises nothing, or one that promises twice and keeps neither promise? Because the shock isn't that Europe wrote this rule. It's what happens to the very next one it wrote, right alongside it. Number 8. The supply chain nobody is policing yet. Right behind it sits the law that was supposed to make big companies answer for who mines their materials and who sews their clothing, the corporate due diligence directive. In America, that answer is still whatever a company's own lawyers decide to disclose, voluntarily, if at all. In Europe, the answer was supposed to be the law itself, binding, checked, national transposition, due by July 26, 2026. Then came the EU's own Stop the Clock directive, in force since March, pushing that deadline to July 2027 and pushing full enforcement of most of the rule out to 2029, 3 years past where this started. A law about looking your own supply chain in the eye just spent its first year looking somewhere else, written by the same people who are supposed to enforce it. 2 rules, 2 of Europe's proudest moral claims, coffee and conscience, human rights and hemlines, and 2 dates that both moved before either one ever had to be kept in the first place. If the coffee and the supply chain couldn't survive their own paperwork, what happens to the rules that actually cost an ordinary household money every single month? Because that is exactly where this list is headed next. Number 7. The rulebook that blinked 5 days early. Brussels spent years calling itself the only government on Earth, writing real, binding rules for artificial intelligence. Not guidelines, not a voluntary code, actual law, covering the hiring algorithm that screens your resume, the score that decides your loan, the camera that reads your face at a stadium turnstile. Those obligations for the highest risk systems were due to bind on August 2, 2026. On July 27th, 5 days before its own deadline, a new package with the almost apologetic name Digital Omnibus quietly pushed the whole thing back to December 2027. This one wasn't even missed. It was pulled, on purpose, 5 days early, by the same government that wrote the deadline in the first place, as though it had only just noticed its own calendar. In America, there is still no single federal AI rulebook at all, high risk or otherwise, and nobody in Washington ever bragged about writing one. The world's self-declared AI rulebook is not a rulebook yet. It's a rough draft with a new due date. An honest, "we haven't gotten to it yet," would have cost less credibility than this. Which one actually sounds more in control? Number 6. The delivery driver, who is still a mystery. Right alongside it is a law that decides whether the person delivering your dinner tonight counts as an employee with sick pay and a pension, or just as an entry in an app's routing software. Member states have until December 2, 2026, to write that answer into national law. As of the middle of this year, not one of the 27 had actually finished doing it. Every other government is still drafting, on a deadline that 4 of the items on this list have already missed for a reason that isn't complicated. Writing the promise down is the easy part, the part that gets a press release and a round of applause. Making it real in 27 separate legal systems, with 27 separate labor ministries arguing over the wording, is the part that stays unscheduled. America never wrote one federal answer to this question either. But when an American state decides it, that state decides it once, not across 27 capitals still arguing about the wording. A driver's own employment status can't get sorted before the deadline even arrives, which is not a reassuring sign for how carefully the algorithm scoring his credit was sorted either. 2 more rules that were supposed to define who counts and who gets counted, both still unfinished business, heading into the part of this list that actually touches your wallet, and the part where the real shocks start. Number 5. The fuel price that never moved. Here's a mystery. Europe wrote itself a brand new carbon price on the fuel that heats your home and the gasoline that fills your car. A real, calculated cost meant to land in 2027, the kind of number that shows up on a receipt, not a press release. So why didn't your heating bill change on the date they promised it would? Because the people who wrote the rule got a good look at the people who'd have to pay it and lost their nerve. Central and Eastern European governments raised the alarm over the cost of living, and Brussels quietly pushed the whole system back a full year to January 2028, before a single household saw the new number on a bill. This is not a missed deadline in the way the others on this list are missed, and it is in its own way worse. This is a government writing a tax for its own citizens, watching them notice, and pulling the date back before the tax ever had the chance to become unpopular. Would you rather your government tax you on the date it promised, honestly, or promise you a tax, let you worry about it for a year, and still make you pay it, just later, once the complaining has died down? Because the next item on this list is the one Europe brags about loudest, and even that one is stuck in the same paperwork it wrote for itself. Number 4. The right to fix your own phone. Europe has spent years marketing itself as the continent that finally made manufacturers repair what they sell you, instead of quietly hoping you'd just buy a new one. Washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, phones, tablets, servers, all of it, at a fair price and in a fair amount of time, even after the warranty has run out. That right became EU law on July 31, 2026, the kind of date that gets circled on a press calendar months in advance. But a right written in Brussels only becomes a right where a national government has actually bothered to write it into national law, and on the day it was supposed to apply everywhere at once, only a handful of the 27 member states had formally told the European Commission they were done. Germany, one of the countries usually held up as ahead of schedule, the responsible one, passed its own version just 5 weeks before the deadline, which is the equivalent of finishing your homework at midnight the night it's due, and still getting to call yourself the class's best student. Most of the other 26 didn't even bring a pencil. Imagine you're a small electronics shop in a country that missed it entirely, standing behind the counter with a stranger's broken phone in your hand and no local law yet telling you what you're required to do about it, or what your customer is actually owed. Meanwhile, New York, California, and Minnesota each passed their own right to repair law years earlier. One state, one legislature, one date, and it was already working, while Brussels was still collecting notifications that hadn't arrived. Is a right that exists on paper in Brussels, but nowhere yet in practice, actually a right at all? The next item on this list isn't about your phone, it's about your messages. Number 3. The messages Brussels still can't decide about. The shock here isn't the scanning, it's the indecision. A systemic failure is how Europe's own airline industry described one of this year's border rollouts. And that same phrase could just as easily describe what's happened to the rule governing your own private messages. The EU's temporary permission letting messaging apps voluntarily scan for child abuse material was due to expire in early April 2026. Then came the vote on July 9th, and this is the part worth slowing down for. More members voted to reject the extension than to keep it, 314 against 276. The extension survived anyway, because killing it needed an absolute majority of the whole parliament, and the rejection fell 47 votes short of that bar. A clear majority of everyone in the room wanted it gone, and it stayed, pushed out to April 2028, while the permanent replacement, the one actually meant to settle this for good, walked out of its fifth negotiating round on June 29th with nothing agreed at all, and talks aren't scheduled to resume until September. 2.5 years after this fight started in public, Europe still has not decided whether it trusts an algorithm to read your WhatsApp or your Signal, and its own temporary fix keeps getting extended for one reason: the permanent answer keeps not showing up to its own meetings. A temporary fix, extended twice, standing in for a decision nobody will make. A rule this personal, about a phone every single European carries in their pocket, and the honest answer to, "Is my private message being read?" is still, after 5 negotiating rounds, "We haven't decided yet." Would you want a government that still can't decide the rule for your own messages after 2.5 years? Or one that decided wrong quickly enough that you could actually argue with it? Number 2 on this list is the rule Europe wrote specifically to prove it isn't run by people like that. Number 2. The paycheck Europe still won't let you see. Picture the job posting. No salary range, same as it's always been, on a continent that has spent years insisting it takes workplace fairness far more seriously than the country it constantly compares itself to, even though Brussels promised, loudly, in speeches and press releases alike, that this would change everywhere by June 7, 2026. That was the deadline for every one of the 27 member states to pass their own law requiring employers to disclose pay ranges up front and to report their own gender pay gaps, the single rule Europe held up hardest as proof it takes fairness more seriously than anyone else on Earth. 4 states made it by the actual date: Slovakia, Italy, Lithuania, and Malta. The other 23 missed it, and it isn't a near miss dressed up as a technicality either. 3 have only partial rules limping along. 10 have a draft bill sitting somewhere in a parliamentary committee. And 10 more, including Germany, Spain, and Sweden, 3 of the largest economies on the continent, don't have a draft law at all, not even a first attempt anyone can point to. 23 out of 27 is not a delay. It is most of a continent quietly deciding the deadline simply didn't apply to it this year. This was never a technically hard law to draft either. It sets a disclosure requirement, not a new agency, not a new court, nothing that needed inventing from scratch. 18 American states and Washington, D.C. already require the salary range to sit right there on the posting, each one its own single law, its own legislature, its own date, no 27-country pileup required to make it real. Europe wanted the credit the day it announced this rule. It still hasn't earned it. Because the last item on this list isn't about your paycheck at all. It's about whether you can even get into the country that already knows how to do this. Number 1. The border that still has no opening date. Here is the real shock, the one Europe should be most embarrassed about, because the other side already solved it, 17 years ago, without a sequel. Years ago, the United States asked every visa-exempt visitor for a quick online authorization before boarding a plane. ESTA. $21. A short form. An approval that usually clears in minutes, and it has simply worked, without a single relaunch, without a single postponement, since 2009. In Europe, the equivalent authorization does not exist yet, in any form, for anyone. Europe decided to build its own version of the same idea, ETIAS, roughly €20 for the same authorization, and originally planned to launch it in 2025. It slipped to late 2026. Then, sometime this year, Brussels quietly removed even that target from its own website. No announcement, no press conference, just a date that used to be there and now isn't. The agency actually running the system said out loud, on the record, that a 2026 launch is no longer feasible. No new date has been announced since. Not this month, not this year. While that authorization system sits unfinished, unlaunched, without so much as a rumor of a date, its sister system, the one that actually checks passports and fingerprints at the physical border, went fully live in April, and within hours produced lines of 3 to 5 hours at some crossings, long enough that Europe's own airline industry, the people whose planes were sitting on the tarmac waiting, called it a systemic failure and not a rough first week. Not a bad opening night. A systemic failure, in their own words, about their own system. So here is what that actually means for anyone planning to visit. Somewhere right now, an American is already booking that trip, with no idea that the system built to wave them through more smoothly does not exist yet, has no date, and might not exist next year either, while the system Europe already switched on is the one making the wait longer for every visitor standing in it. 10 protections, promised for one single calendar year, each one announced like a finish line. 8 of them still not real by the time this video went up. Brussels signed first on every single one. Nobody ever came back to finish the second half. Europe is not wrong that it writes more protections into law than America ever bothers to. It is wrong to think writing one down is the same as delivering it. And before Europe gets to say America is no better, some of it did copy pieces of this. New York, California, and Minnesota already run their own right-to-repair laws. 18 American states already put the salary on the job posting, and Washington ended its own version of the parcel exemption the same year Brussels did. But look at what those have in common that this list doesn't. Each one is a single government, choosing on a single date, with no other capital left to wait on. To be fair, not everything on this list slipped either. The USB-C rule for new laptops landed exactly on time in April, the one genuine, uncomplicated win on this list, and even America's own manufacturers had to follow it. But one win out of 10 is not a system working. It is a system that occasionally remembers to check its own calendar. A separate accounting of the EU's own competitiveness promises, the ones its leaders made to each other back in 2024, found barely more than 1 in 10 had actually been carried out by last year. This list is not an exception to how Brussels operates. It is a fairly typical sample of it. Would you rather live under fewer rules that actually arrive on the day they're promised, or under more rules you're still waiting to meet? Tell us in the comments which one of these 10 should have been finished first. If this kept you watching for the full list, give it a like. It helps push videos like this past the algorithm's own gatekeeping. And subscribe, with the notification bell on, so you don't miss the next accounting of promises Europe made and hasn't cashed yet. This video draws on publicly available regulatory filings and news reporting, put together strictly to inform and to explain. Nothing here speaks for the European Union, for any single member state, or for any government body, and none of it is aimed at any one person, culture, or institution.